to welcome Professor Neil Lewis from Georgetown University, a specialist in medieval philosophy like all of us. But in specific, you've worked extensively on Richard Rufus of Cornwall and been involved in the editing of his works, if I understand correctly. So you bring to us a special expertise in the English Franciscan school, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the debate over the unicity of truth in this school. So I don't want to take any more of your time. Just go ahead and use the time that you need,
Okay,
and
okay.
don't worry about that.
Well, of course, the real expert on Rufus is Rager. I learned my Rufus via Rager. Um, but we will be talking about Rufus to some extent today. There is a handout for this, and it's just basically some information about the text and the main passages I will read in the Latin text, but I'll read them in translation. So, that there's just one truth, veritas, is suggested by numerous passages in patristic thinkers, notably Augustine, and was defended by Anselm in his treatise De Veritate. Yet there are many passages in patristic authors and in Augustine and Anselm themselves suggesting there is a multiplicity of truths. And it is, I suspect, this apparent conflict that led the medieval thinkers considered here to take up the question of the unicity of truth. Now, an adequate response to the question whether there's only one truth must accommodate the idea that there is a supreme truth, the eternal word, that plays a special role in regard to truth, while also making sense of talk of a plurality of truths. My concern in this talk will be to examine how three thinkers employ logical notions in their attempts to meet this desideratum. I'm not going to try to go into metaphysics here. These thinkers are Robert Grosseteste, Richard Rufus of Cornwall, and Thomas of York. Grosseteste was the first lecturer to the Oxford Franciscans from about 1229 to 1235, when he was made Bishop of Lincoln. Although never a Franciscan himself, Grosseteste left a deep impression on English Franciscans, both in personal example and thought. Rufus lectured on Aristotle's works on natural philosophy and metaphysics in Paris from the early 1230s until 1238. He was one of the most important figures in the early reception of these works in the Latin West. In 1238, he renounced his career as a secular master and joined the Franciscan order in Paris. He left Paris for Oxford to make his profession and to study theology. In 1256, he became the fifth Franciscan lecturer to the Oxford Franciscans, preceding Rufus in 1253 as the fourth Franciscan lecturer at Oxford was Thomas of York. From 1256 until his death, possibly around 1260, York was the sixth Franciscan lecturer at Cambridge. It's well known that there are doctrinal relationships among these thinkers, although their exact nature and extent is still to be determined. Among topics all three consider is the unicity of truth. Grosseteste devoted a treatise, De Veritate, to it, written at Oxford probably between about 1225 and the early 1230s. This seems to be the first extensive treatment to follow Anselm's. Rufus considers it in his two metaphysics commentaries, an early short questions commentary, which Rager has called the Memoriale in Metaphysicam, M.Met, written about 1231, and a subsequent very large exposition plus questions commentary, the Scriptum, in Metaphysicam, S.Met, written about 1238, the first part of which we hope will be reaching your friendly bookseller sometime in the not too distant future. Put in a little plug there. And later, now as a Franciscan, Rufus considers the issue in his two sentences commentaries, his Oxford lectures on the sentences around 1250, and his Paris lectures around 1253. York treats the topic in Book 6, Chapter 25 of his massive philosophical Summa, the Sapientiale, a work he never finished. How are these works related? There's no indication that Rufus used Grosseteste De Veritate in either of the metaphysics commentaries, though he certainly used the later recension of Grosseteste De Libero Arbitrio in the Scriptum. The two sentence commentaries show clear signs of use of Grosseteste De Veritate, as does York's Sapientiale. The Sapientiae also draws from the scriptum. That is something we will try to show in the introduction to the addition to that, which we are in preparation of. Whether it also draws from the Oxford Lectures is unclear, given our uncertainty about the date and circulation of the Sapientiale. I believe we have one of the editors of the Sapientiale in the audience, so they may be able to help us on these matters. There is undoubtedly closely parallel material in the two works, but the direction of borrowing remains to be determined. And the Paris sentence commentary borrows material from the Oxford one, and since its treatment of the unicity of truth largely reprises what's found in the Oxford Lectures, I won't say much about it here. Now, a couple of preliminaries before we get into the details of these works. In the debate over the unicity of truth, the term truth renders veritas. No one doubted that there are many truths, vera, that is, things that are true. The question is whether there is but a single truth, the supreme truth, by which they are true. That there is a supreme truth identified with God, or more particularly the eternal word, is also not in dispute. The question is whether there are other truths besides this. The fact that there are many true things does not settle this issue. Our authors all mention Anselm's point that although there are many simultaneous temporal things, there is only one time. The question is whether the supreme truth is related to true things in a similar way. So to avoid terminological confusion here, I shall always use the word truth to render veritas, and I'll say true thing or true item to render verum. The second point concerns what sort of truth is at issue in this debate. Now, medieval thinkers apply the term true to quite different kinds of things. So we must consider the possibility that the debate over the unicity of truth is intended to concern only the truth of some, but not all true things. Now, the most important distinction amongst true things is between propositions or proposition-like items in the soul, or often called compositions and divisions, and extramental things. This is often called the distinction between complex and non-complex truth. That is, the truth of complex items and of non-complexes, in the relevant regard, things. Non-complex truth is the truth of extramental things. There is, incidentally, and also a sense of non-complex truth for ideas in the mind, but I'm not going into that here. This conception of non-complex truth and true things has a long history, and is certainly present in Grosseteste and York, and also in Rufus, with the possible exception of the short metaphysics commentary, which focuses on the truth of complexes. There's no doubt in the treatments of the unicity of truth our authors have in mind non-complex truth. It's less clear whether complex truth is also at issue. I'm inclined to think that their remarks do extend to it, but this poses additional issues I can't go into here, so I'll leave this issue unresolved. Now, as noted, our authors attempt to meet the desideratum mentioned above by mobilizing theories of a logical nature. Grosseteste and York propose similar views, with York's being an elaboration of Grosseteste's. Their basic point is that the supreme truth is in some way always signified in some manner when we speak of truth, and yet there is a plurality of truths supposited by expressions such as every truth or many truths. Rufus holds that word truth is an analogical term said according to prior and posterior, or primary and derivative. He too holds that whenever we use the term truth, there is an indirect reference to the supreme truth, but this is because when we speak of other truths, they are not truths in a strict sense. Instead, they are called truths because they have a certain kind of relationship, an attributio, as it's put in the translations of the Verres, to the single truth, the supreme truth. Therefore, according to all three authors, some sort of indirect reference to the supreme truth is present in our talk of truth, but Grosseteste and York think that in a proper sense there are also other truths, while Rufus says that although we may speak of other truths, they're not truths in a strict and unqualified sense. Now I'm going to turn to Grosseteste. One of Grosseteste's chief reasons to reject the unicity of truth is given in one of his initial pro-arguments for a plurality of truths. He notes that, and I quote, "If there's no truth other than the supreme truth, then truth is one and singular and does not admit distribution or plurality, so that we may say every truth or many truths. And yet, Grosseteste notes in the Gospel, John, we read, he will teach you every truth. So right at the start of De Veritate, Grosseteste brings logical considerations into his treatment of the unicity of truth. And the same is true of his account of the nature of truth itself. And since this account plays an important role in York, a brief overview is appropriate. Thus, Grosseteste starts his account of the nature of truth in general by considering the true things considered in logic, noting that we're most accustomed to speak of the truth of a spoken declarative sentence, an oratio enunciativa. Starting with an account of the truth of declarative sentences, he brilliantly spins out of it an all-embracing account of truth, both complex and non-complex, both created and uncreated, which he takes to be equivalent to Anselm's definition of truth as rectitude or rightness perceptible by the mind alone. Now, the truth of the declarative sentence, this is the text with one besides it in the handout. As the or a, it's not clear whether this is a reference to Aristotle, says, as a philosopher says, it is nothing other than so to be in the thing signified as speech says. And this is what others say the truth is the adequation of speech and thing and the adequation of things and thoughts. Possibly he meant the first formulation, which I have a one next to be from Aristotle, though it's actually much closer to what we find in Abelard and perhaps represents the influence of 12th century authors. Grosseteste takes this definition to be equivalent, at least extensionally, to the definition of truth in terms of adequation, an idea quite new in his day, doesn't seem to have been around from before the 1220s in the Latin West. Whether he proposes one or two definitions above in terms of adequation is unclear. Thomas of York treats the two last definitions as distinct, attributing them incorrectly to Boethius and Isaac Israeli, respectively. We have no idea where these come from, these definitions, and they get attributed to all sorts of people by medieval and contemporary authors. I'm inclined to think that for Grosseteste, just if we leave aside the speech-thoughts distinction, they are intended to be equivalent because he treats adequation as a symmetric relation. The things-to-thought direction of the definition will enable him to employ the notion of adequation in his account of non-complex truth, that is, the truth of extra-mental things. Grosseteste proceeds to note that inner speech, that is, the thought expressed by vocal speech, is truer than vocal speech. He presumably has in mind the idea that vocal speech is an expression of inner speech, and hence that in a primary sense, it is inner rather than outer speech. That is true, a fairly common view. Now, if there is inner speech that is not just adequated to things, but is its very own adequation to them, it will not just be true, but will be truth itself. But this is how it is with the speech or word of the Father. It's not only adequated to what it says, but is adequation itself. This is an allusion, we might note, to the doctrine expressly mentioned by York, that in the case of God, if a concrete term can be predicated, so can the corresponding abstract one. God is true and truth. God is adequated and adequation. Considering the things-to-thought direction of adequation, Grosseteste notes that there will be a conformity of things said by the word to the word, or more particularly their rationes in the word. This conformity to the eternal word is their rightness and obligation to be what they are. And since a thing is true to the extent that it is as it ought to be, the truth of things is their being as they ought to be, and their rectitude and conformity to the word by whom they are eternally said. End quote. And since this sort of rectitude is perceptible only by the mind, Anselm correctly defined truth as rectitude perceptible by the mind alone, a definition that applies both to a rectifying rectitude, the word, and a rectified rectitude, the truth of things. In this way, Grosseteste spins out of the adequation account of complex or propositional truth a general account of truth applicable to the truth of all true things, complex and non-complex. I'm going to skip just a little here about the distinction between first and second being in Grosseteste, so we'll save a little time and go on to his response to the question about unicity. In his response to the question whether there is only one truth, Grosseteste returns to the initial arguments he'd given in favor of a plurality of truths, holding that they are correct. But he also provides an account of semantics of the name truth that assigns a special place to the supreme truth. And this has got number 2 next to it in the Grosseteste material. We also think, as Augustine suggests in his book on lying, that the truth of things is multiple. Otherwise, the name truth would not admit plurality or distribution. For the relation of one thing to many doesn't make that one thing many, any more than the relation of one time to many simultaneous temporal things makes that one time many times. There are not many simultaneous times. In the same way, if there are only the supreme truth, which in itself is just one, on account of the relation of that one truth to many things could be true, just as many temporal things are simultaneous. But there would not on this account be many truths any more than many simultaneous times. So he's pointing out here that just from the mere fact that there are many true things, you can't infer plurality of truths. He's inferring it from the fact that there are plural or distributed terms. The expression many truths or every truth is going to be his reason. So he continues on. For a plural name, or one distributed by means of a universal sign, omnis, for example, requires many supposits. Accordingly, we could not say many truths or every truth unless there were many truths supposited. Therefore, in such expressions, the truths of things are supposited, these truths being conformities to the reasons of the things in the eternal truth. But perhaps the name truth is used nowhere without signifying as form of the name, in some way, at least adjacently or obliquely, the supreme truth. For just as the truth of the thing can be understood only in the light of or thought of only in the light of the supreme truth, so perhaps nor is it supposited by the name truth, except with signification of the supreme truth. There's therefore just one truth everywhere signified and predicated by this name truth, as Anselm says, but in the many truths of things, that one truth is called many truths. So Grosseteste is defending a plurality of truths on the basis of the way plural or distributed nouns work. It was standardly held in his day that the distributive word omnis requires at least 3 supposits. That is, a sentence like every A is B requires for its truth there be at least 3 A's. Obviously, correct use of the plural many truths would seem to require more than one truth. People did debate that you could have universal claims about phoenixes being true, perhaps. Peter of Spain says even there's only one phoenix at a time. In any event, in this material, Grosseteste appeals to notions from terminus logic, those of the suppositum of a name and of its signification. Now, despite differences of detail among different logicians, the basic ideas of signification supposition may be very briefly put. I am going to abstract from certain issues in this material. Signification is a fixed feature of a spoken sound. Spoken sounds receive signification when they're introduced into the language or imposed, to use a technical word. William of Sherwood, writing in Paris between about 1235 and 1250, defined signification as the presentation of a form to the intellect, often to signify as described following Boethius' translation of De Interpretatione as to establish a thought. In other words, a word signifies what it brings to mind as a matter of its conventional introduction. Thus, as Paul Spade notes, signification is a psychologico-causal notion. What a name signifies was typically taken in the period we're interested in to be a form or common nature of some sort. The name is said to be imposed from such a form or nature. This form, as York will expressly tell us, is what is meant by the expression form of the name, used above by Grosseteste. Supposition, in a strict sense, is a property of a name. Names include adjectives, by the way, for these writers. A kind of spoken sound endowed with signification, that's a name, as it occurs in a sentence. So a name supposition can vary depending on its intentional context. It's the notion of supposition is roughly akin to our idea of what a word stands for or refers to. There are many kinds of suppositions since sentential context can radically vary what the same name stands for. For example, in the sentence, white is a word, the name white stands for itself. In more usual sentence, like Socrates is white, the name white supposits or stands for the things having whiteness, that is, the white things. So Gross's test is concerned with the use of the abstract name, truth, not verum, in either plural form is distributed by every, and this name signifies the form truth, it seems, but being an abstract name would typically supposit or stand not for things having truth, as the adjectival name true would, but for truths themselves, as for example whitenesses or every whiteness would do. It would stand for whitenesses, what we might call token truths. But in all cases, the word continues to signify the form from which it was imposed, as this is not a variable feature of the name. So it's this distinction between supposition and signification allows Gross's test both to hold that in fact the expressions truths or every truth do supposit or stand for a multiplicity of truths, the truths of things, while at the same time accounting for the special place of the supreme truth in terms of signification. Thus, as he remarks, the name truth is perhaps used nowhere without signifying as form of the name in some way, at least adjacently or obliquely, the supreme truth. This is not exactly the most straightforward statement with multiple qualifications. Gross's test supports it by noting an epistemological parallel. Quote, just as the truth of a thing can be understood only in the light of the supreme truth, so perhaps nor is it supposited by the name truth except with the signification of the supreme truth. He's here referring to his view earlier in the treatise that our knowledge of truth requires the light of the supreme truth, but one can in some way be cognizant of the supreme truth without realizing one is so cognizant, as happens with those who are not pure of heart. Gross writes, there's no way, no one, Gross remarks, who is cognizant of something true who is also not in some way, either knowingly or unknowingly, cognizant of the supreme truth itself. So what he may mean in the passage above is that in fact the form signified by truth is the supreme truth, but the speaker or listener may not realize that this is so. The supreme truth would then be signified in an indirect manner in the sense that the form truth that is signified, and of which the speaker or listener thinks, is in fact the supreme truth. And this conception of the supreme truth, God as form, accords with Gross's conception in his treatise De Unica Forma Omnium that God indeed is first form. And this is a view that in fact York will adopt. So now I'm going to move on to Rufus. He first takes up the question of unicity in the short metaphysics commentary and has very little to say. He just writes, there is just one truth as principle, but many in respect of participation. Here at least he seems prepared to speak of many truths, but in subsequent works he does assert the unicity of truth. So the scriptum contains a much more detailed treatment, and at the end of his discussion there, Rufus claims there's just one truth. Now for my purposes, the argument of most interest for the proposition is the first one he gives, and this argument is based on the idea that the name true, and I'm now using the adjective verum, is said multiply, or according to before and after, of God and creatures. In his discussion later in the scriptum of the name entity, ens, another term said multiply, Rufus describes such a term as an analogical term. And in his defense of the unicity of truth in his sentence commentaries, he expressly propounds the view that true and truth are analogical names. Although in those works he always adds, but I'm not going to decide anything on this, which is typical of Rufus in them. So I take them to be expressing his views, but he's covering his rear end, as it were, when he makes those remarks. Reagan may or may be able to say more about that practice. So Rufus's treatment of the unicity of truth introduces a different logical consideration into the picture from what we find in Gross, Test, and York. They mobilize the distinction between signification and supposition. Rufus mobilizes the notion of analogy. So I just want to say a little more about this notion of analogy. I'm not going to read the long quote of the kinds of names, but I wanted to say a little bit entity ends. In Book 7 of the Scriptum, and this is the text 3 in Rufus, Rufus notes that Aristotle holds that entity is said multiply, but not equivocally, but analogically, for entity is said of one nature primarily, namely substance, and of others derivatively, namely of accidents. And this is on account of some relationship they have to substance. Here he's using the language of Averroes' commentary and presenting Aristotle's notion of what's sometimes now called focal meaning, that there's a sort of primary use, but the same word can be used of other things in a way relating to that primary use. And he actually gives us a classification of the different kinds of names here, analogical, multiply said, purely equivocal, and purely univocal. I just want to mention the very last part of this, which I think I have in boldface on the handout. A name is multiply said when the spoken word is one, vox, spoken sound, I should say. Vox technically is a spoken sound, it's not yet a word. The thing too, or nature, is one, but the account or intentio, whatever that is, maybe concept he's getting at, is not one, as is the case with the name entity. I'll just note as an aside, I'm not going to say more about this, that when he uses analogy in this passage, he's using it not in the sense which it's equivalent to multiply said. He's using to refer to what's called the analogy of proportionality, and I think it's there for the sake of completeness, and it's never used again in the text. So we've got this distinction between the spoken sound, the thing or nature, and the ratio or intentio, but he leaves their relation to the name unspecified, but I think it's plausible to think that the thing or nature is the form or nature signified by the name. Similar accounts were proposed in the mid-13th century by Peter of Spain and Lambert of Auxerre. They treat names said multiply as equivocal, but not purely equivocal. Although they don't distinguish the name from the spoken sound, they do distinguish the thing signified in the ratio or intentio, having in mind that in the use of such names, the thing signified, the thing or nature, will be thought of or conceived in different ways, that is, by different rationes. And Rufus seems to have a similar idea in mind. In the case of the name entity, Rufus says, the spoken sound is one, and the nature is one, because that nature is substance, for entities predicated of nothing else directly. Hence Aristotle says accidents are not entities, they are of an entity. Hence, where entity is said, substance is there thought of, whether obliquely or directly, but the account of the name entity is diverse, for one sort of entity exists in its own right, and one does not. All right, I want to draw 2 points from this passage. First is that whenever entity is said, there's the thought of substance, the nature that the word signifies, either directly as when it's predicated of a substance, or obliquely or indirectly when it's predicated of an accident. And you think of the case when it's predicated of an entity, we're actually using an oblique case in the Latin here, and that's probably where that expression is coming from. The second point is that when an accident is called an entity, this is really a kind of an extended use of the term entity, and Rufus actually expressly says this. Accidents are not entities in the strict sense of the term, because if they were, we could predicate directly entity of them. Instead, they are items standing in some relationship, inherent to substances. So it's not incorrect to say that accidents are entities any more than to use another example of a word said multiply, that urine is healthy. But we must bear in mind that those are not direct predications of the natures in question, substance or health, signified by the names. So now I want to return to truth. I may have to move through Rufus a bit more quickly. In the Scriptum, Rufus presents the idea that the adjectival name true is multiply said as a reason for holding that there's just one truth. Now, his thought seems to be that in the case of true, it can only be said in a primary sense of one thing, namely God, and this being so, since concrete and abstract terms co-apply in the case of God, there will just be one truth. And this is the text 5. And I will read this one quickly. The first course is true and caused things are true, therefore the name true is said of caused things and of the first cause, either then it's predicated equivocally or univocally or is said multiply. You'll notice that fourth thing's disappeared from the discussion. Not univocally, because nothing is said purely univocally of the creator and creatures. This, incidentally, is a doctrine that Grosseteste expressly proposes. Not equivocally, because then there'd be no ordering or implication between true said of the first himself and said of these things. In the same way, nor would this be the case with good if it was said equivocally. But there in fact isn't ordering, therefore, etc. Therefore it will be said multiply, but a name said multiply of many things primarily belongs to one and is imposed on others derivatively on account of some relationships that they have to that one. Wherever such a name is predicated, that nature is predicated on which it's primarily imposed, though sometimes the nature is predicated directly and sometimes obliquely. If this is so, then since true belongs to the first with capital F, it will sometimes be predicated directly, namely when it's predicated of the first, and of other things obliquely. Therefore, there is only one true item, only one verum. So Rufus is claiming here that the nature signified by true is predicated whenever this name is predicated, but it's only predicated directly when it's predicated of the first cause, God. Otherwise, it's predicated indirectly or obliquely. And since it's only predicated directly of one thing, God, when other things are said to be true, what is really being said is they stand in some sort of nature, relationship to the nature predicated. It can't be directly said of any true item that it's true. Of course, in this case, the nature in question, which presumably is truth, is identical with God. So when created things are said to be true, properly speaking, it's being said that they stand in some sort of relationship to truth. And therefore God. The nature is not being directly predicated of them. Now clearly there's a metaphysical thesis being presupposed here about the relationship of God and creatures vis-a-vis truth, and that's not something I plan to go into here. In fact, what I'm going to do now, because time is moving away from us, I was just going to talk about how this doctrine we find repeated in the sentences commentaries, and you can see the Latin text for those in the handout. If you are a glutton for punishment, you can go and read those. But what he does, he throws a little more light on the relationship, and he uses the notion of a likeness, and in fact he used the notion of what he calls an imitative likeness in espar, which is language coming out of Grosseteste de Libro Arbitrio. So, let me move on to Thomas of York. I think we can get through him. As I noted above, I think there's persuasive evidence that York used the scriptum in the Sapientiale. This is something I will try to show in the introduction to our edition of the scriptum. And in his treatment of truth, we find a number of arguments pro and con that have clear parallels to the scriptum. But York does not follow Rufus's lead. His response to the question of unicity doesn't appeal to analogy, but instead is a development of Grosseteste's view. Like Grosseteste, York posits a multiplicity of truths. He holds that truth can be defined most generally as, quote, adequation, that is rectitude. As Grosseteste had said, in the eternal word there's adequation to the things it says, and so truth. Indeed, the word is not just adequated, but is adequation itself, quote, since whatever is said of God is said in both a concrete way and abstract way, therefore God is not only adequated, but is adequation itself, and therefore truth, end quote. And for the same reason, truth is called rectitude, since all adequation is a kind of rectitude. We saw Grosseteste hold that wherever truth is said, the supreme truth is signified in some way, at least indirectly or obliquely. I'd suggested he thinks that there's always signification of the form truth, and that form is in fact God, the first form, although one using the term truth may not realize this fact. And it's notable then that York begins his response to the question of unicity by distinguishing two types of form. And the forms are one that's not formed, that gives form to all things. This is the text number 7. As wise Augustine says in On True Religion, and this is God who is the form of all things. This is definitely a Grossetestian doctrine. And in another mode, by the form of things is meant form formed by the prior form, and indeed form in this second sense is the very essence of things, of a thing, or rooted in it, and this form is varied as the things themselves are varied and numbered. And as it is for form, so it is for truth, York continues, for form itself is the first truth. As truth is adequation, then paralleling giving form and being formed, we have what is adequating, the adequator, and what is adequated. To explain this, York borrows an analogy Grosseteste had used in De Veritate to explain why nothing is seen to exist except in the Supreme Being. Grosseteste notes that just as water has no intrinsic shape, is given shape by the shape of its container, so of itself a creature does not exist, but it's liable to fall into non-existence. For a creature to exist just is for it to be supported by the eternal word, just as for water to have shape is for it to be shaped by its container. So likewise York holds, this is number 8, I will read this one. There's a clever adaptation of Grosseteste's analogy to the case of truth. We can consider adequation in two ways, as it is in the adequator and as it is in what is adequated. Adequation in what is adequated cannot exist without adequation in the adequator, any more than a passion without an action, or shape in what shape without a shaping shape, or illuminating color without illuminating lumen, and likewise nor rectified rectitude without a rectifying rectitude. Hence, since truth is adequation or rectitude, there cannot be the adequated truth that is an adequated adequation or a rectified rectitude without a rectifying and adequating rectitude and adequation. You'll be tested on this at the end of the talk. Just as if water were put in a vessel, it would be given a shape by the shape of the vessel, say square, or perhaps cubic might be better here. So it's impossible for the water to be square except on account of the square shape of the container. For this reason, we say that water is shaped by the shape alone of the container, because with this alone posited, shape is made. With it removed, it's not shaped. And yet, in the water itself, there is the shape that is the quality of it, apart from the shape of the container, and that is produced by the container. And so in this respect, it can be said it's shaped by that shape alone. No matter what may be said, it's impossible to think of one shape without the other, which seems right, for water at least. York takes the same to hold of truth, and the same holds for truth, for it's impossible for any creature to subsist except by being conformed to the first truth. That is, by being conformed to it, it's supported in existence. Otherwise, it would fall into nothing, according to Augustine and Gregory. And therefore, just as the shape of a container is obliquely predicated the shape of what's contained, and yet this is not that, so in the name being, and consequently in the name truth, the first entity and first truth is predicated, even though the first entity or first truth is not principally predicated of any being or truth. Perhaps he means just any being or truth. The analogy with water allows us to identify two shapes, that of water and its container. One can't think of water as having a determinate shape without at the same time thinking of it as contained by a container with specifically the same shape. If you think of water as square, you're thinking of it as having a square container implicitly, and when you call the water square, you're obliquely predicating the shape of the container in some way. In effect, you're thinking and saying it has a shape that conforms to that of its container. So true with truth for York, that is adequation. There can't be adequated adequation, the truth of a creature, without an adequating adequation, the supreme truth. The supreme truth is, as it were, the exemplar of how a thing should be. And in its creating that thing, thus bringing it about that there is the adequation of the thing to it, it produces an adequated adequation. But as with the case of the shape of water, York thinks that our talk of truth involves some kind of indirect signification of the supreme truth, the adequating adequation. And he sums this view up in the following words. This is the last passage. I say, therefore, from what has been said above, that since truth, the word is imposed from adequation, and this adequation is the form of the word truth, because form is that from which a name is imposed, according to Aristotle, and the suppositum of this name truth is that on which the name is imposed. The suppositum of this name truth is multipliable, that is, there can be many of them. And since the supposita are all the entities, truths are numbered and multiplied as entities are numbered and multiplied, but in regard to form there is only one truth, namely the uncreated divine truth, which is that to which there is the adequation of all truths. And therefore it's said more truly than every other, as we said above. So I think what's going on here is we're getting Grosseteste's view in a more elaborated form. In particular, York's making explicit what he takes the form of a name to be. It's the form from which the name is imposed. And in the case of the name truth, that form is adequation. And so this is what the name signifies and brings to mind. But the form adequation, in fact, is God. I'll just make a note. This might seem like straining analogy with water, but I'm not going to go into this in this paper. But if you think about what he's getting at, this notion of God as adequation, this is a notion of truth that is normative, in a notion of what a thing should be, and God is, as it were, God is the what a thing should be, and the divine reasons are the what it is for a thing to be. So if you're thinking of something as true, you're implicitly thinking of what it should be. And when you're doing that, you're indirectly, your thought really is referring to God. You might not realize that. The claim is not that you realize it, but once you grant the normativity of truth, as these writers do, that's not an implausible view, and you believe in God, etc. Once you grant all of that stuff, this is not a crazy view at all. So one thing just to note, and I'll end on this point, that in this passage, he notes that we must distinguish the form from which a name is imposed from that on which is imposed. That is the suppositor, what it stands for. This is a distinction made by a number of authors. It's found in Albert and Aquinas, for example. Usually it's put in terms of concrete names like white. The name white is imposed from the form whiteness, and is this form that the name white signifies, but is imposed on the things having this form. In the case of the name truth, there's the common nature or form, adequation, from which the name is imposed, which York equates with God, and there are the things for which it is imposed. But here matter is somewhat different, for unlike white, truth is not a concrete name, but an abstract name, and York, like Grosseteste before him, takes it to supposit or stand for particular truths. Remember, I'm using truth here to mean veritas, veritates, or at least I think he takes it to do so in the expressions every truth or many truths. So we might call these token truths. This would be akin to the name whiteness, which signifies the form whiteness, and expressions like every whiteness or many whitenesses would stand for particular token whitenesses. So to conclude, it's evident that I've touched on only the tip of the iceberg in these remarks on the unicity of truth, focusing on the logical issues raised by our authors. A fuller treatment would need to examine more closely the doctrine of participation and the metaphysical background our authors are assuming, which in the case of Rufus, and especially Grosseteste, is not an easy task, given they devote no question, to my knowledge, expressly to such metaphysical issues. And I have a suspicion that if we do this, we might find that what look like really strong differences of view between these authors aren't really quite as strong as they seem. But I'm not yet in a position to know whether that suspicion is correct or not. What is certainly clear from this investigation, and I would have gone into some other issues if I had time, is that the treatments of unicity in these authors are intertwined with one another. And I think this will be found to be true for other important topics of their day, especially theological topics. For example, it is true also regarding the complex debate over the eternal truths. So slowly, step by often painful step, we're making clear the dependencies and movements of thought among English thinkers. Thanks a lot.